Laura Winslow had not planned to return to her father's home, not this year, not like this. Her life in Seattle was steady. Shift work at the clinic, a cramped apartment filled with plants and books, and just enough distance from the desert town she'd once escaped. But when her father, Marvin Winslow, called and said he needed a hand after a minor knee surgery, she packed her things in silence. It was not the kind of favor you refused. Marvin was not a man of many requests. When she pulled up to the old ranch-style house, everything looked exactly as it had 10 years ago. The bleached gravel driveway, the low stucco walls the color of old bone, the faded green trim around the windows, and, of course, the shed. That shed. It sat like a forgotten punctuation mark in the far corner of the backyard, made of gray, weather-worn wood, with a sloped metal roof and a heavy padlock on the door. She remembered the way he used to vanish into it for hours, emerging only for dinner, his hands smelling faintly of something metallic and antiseptic. She never knew what he did in there and, truthfully, had stopped wondering sometime in high school. There had been rules. Don't open the shed, don't ask about the shed, don't follow him into the shed. She didn't. Now, years later, the place still gave her the same unease, as though it had its own pulse. Her father, tall even as he limped to greet her, wore the same jeans and flannel he always did, his handshake stiff, his hug an afterthought. He grumbled something about painkillers and dinner and then shuffled back inside, leaving her to carry the bags. The first week passed quietly. She cooked, ran errands, organized the dusty hallway closet, and tried not to notice the strange way he paused at the window every evening, staring toward the shed as if expecting something. When she asked him whether he needed help with whatever was in there, he only replied, "That's sorted. Just keep the side gate latched." At night, Laura sometimes heard a faint humming, soft, rhythmic, almost musical. It came from the backyard, and it stopped the moment she stepped onto the porch. One night, unable to sleep, she watched from the kitchen window as a dull light blinked from the crack beneath the shed door. Not flickering, but deliberate. On, off, almost like a code. In the morning, she asked him about it casually over coffee. Marvin looked at her for a moment too long before replying. "That shed's nothing anymore. Just a box of ash waiting to happen." The words chilled her, not because of what he said, but because of how he said it, with a calm, measured certainty, like he had already imagined the moment it would burn and made peace with the idea. Laura didn't know what bothered her more, the blinking light or the fact that her father, once the most predictable man she knew, had started speaking like someone who was expecting an ending. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the shed burned. Not in the dramatic way Laura might have imagined. No roar of flames clawing at the sky, no explosions, no emergency sirens howling through the neighborhood. It happened with almost clinical precision, disturbingly quiet, as if the fire had been trained to obey a script. Laura had driven 20 minutes into town to pick up a prescription for her father and some groceries, and when she returned just after 4, she found the backyard roped off with red plastic tape, the air heavy with an acrid smell that clung to her, clothes and tongue like a warning. 2 men in pale gray uniforms stood by the back fence, talking to someone who wore an HOA-issued vest and held a clipboard like a badge of authority. No one looked particularly concerned, just mildly inconvenienced, as though a lawnmower had malfunctioned or a streetlight had gone out. Her father sat on the patio chair, legs stiffly crossed, his gaze fixed on the smoldering remains of the shed. There was no panic in his eyes, no urgency. He wasn't even angry. He looked like someone watching the final act of a play he had already seen too many times. The fire had devoured everything except the concrete slab foundation and a blackened ring of dirt around it. Not even the door had survived. The trees nearby were untouched, the grass barely singed. Laura's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the wreckage, something primal in her resisting the sight, not because she had loved the shed, but because it felt like something vital had been extracted from her father's world, surgically, without. consent. One of the men in uniform, he didn't introduce himself, but his tone made it clear he expected obedience, explained in vague terms that there had been a malfunction. A wiring issue, possibly. The HOA representative, a tall man named Graham with an unsettlingly smooth voice, added that the structure had been non-compliant with updated community safety codes and had posed an unattended risk under the revised energy regulations. He handed Laura a pamphlet printed on heavy paper titled Safe Spaces, Modernizing Outbuildings for Environmental Integrity. Inside was a list of shed materials deemed unsafe, a diagram of airflow zones, and a flowchart suggesting acceptable dimensions for auxiliary structures. She asked, why wasn't there any notice? Graham smiled with something like practiced sympathy and replied, the HOA has emergency authority under Clause 7C to neutralize structural hazards when resident safety is considered potentially compromised. In those cases, preemptive notification is discouraged to avoid interference. He handed her a separate sheet, an invoice for the controlled removal of the structure, itemized. Laura turned to her father, hoping for an outburst, for something sharp or furious, but he only asked if she'd picked up the coffee beans. That night, she couldn't sleep. The fire left behind more than ash. She could feel it in the silence of the house, in the unnatural stillness of the backyard. Her father didn't speak of the shed again, didn't reference what was lost, didn't even mention the sudden disappearance of the padlock keys he always kept in the drawer next to the sink. But Laura knew something was wrong. There was a pressure under her skin, like a noise just below hearing. She tried calling the HOA office the next day, hoping to get someone other than Graham, but every extension rerouted her back to him. When she asked about the Clause 7C he had mentioned, he chuckled and said, "It's standard. Check the charter." Page 143. There were only 62 pages in the copies she had. That evening, Laura went into the backyard alone. The scorched square where the shed had stood was strangely clean. Too clean. The soil was perfectly level, the edges geometrically precise. She bent down and brushed the surface with her fingers, expecting soot, but found instead a faint texture of etched lines. Fine, cross-hatched grooves that didn't match any burn pattern she had ever seen. They felt mechanical, intentional. Her fingers trembled. This wasn't debris. This was a surface designed to be revealed. The next morning, a letter arrived. No return address, just her name in block letters. Inside, a single typed sentence. If you retrieved anything from the site, please return it to the HOA drop point within 24 hours. No signature, no explanation. She hadn't taken anything, not yet, but now she felt she should have. That afternoon, her father finally said something that pierced her. As she brought him his tea, he looked at her with an expression so flat it was almost blank, and muttered, "It's never just a structure, Laura. Nothing they burn is ever just a structure." He didn't explain who they were. She didn't ask. But she understood then that the burning of the shed had not been an accident, nor an enforcement of some obscure HOA regulation. It had been a signal, to him, to someone else, to everyone watching, a deliberate act that dismantled something beyond walls and nails. And whatever had been inside, whatever lived or waited or worked in that space, it was never meant to be found, not by the fire, not by her, and certainly not by anyone she could call. 3 days after the fire, Laura found the first capsule. It was embedded just beneath the surface of the scorched soil, lodged like a seed that had refused to die. She hadn't been searching. She had only come out early in the morning, barefoot, coffee cooling in her hand, unable to stop herself from standing in that empty, blackened square. She felt drawn to it, not by curiosity anymore, but by something more instinctive. The same way you check the back seat of your car, even when you know it's empty. The dirt was oddly soft in one corner, and when she nudged it with her foot, The tip of something metallic caught the light. She knelt, set the mug down, and began digging gently, half expecting to find a scorched hinge or bolt. Instead, she pulled up a capsule no larger than her thumb, perfectly smooth and sealed, marked with a single number, 06, in faint blue ink. It was warm. Not hot, but warmer than the soil around it, as if it had a pulse of its own. For several long seconds, she simply sat there, staring at the thing in her palm. It wasn't a tool. It wasn't debris. It wasn't normal. When she walked back into the kitchen, her father was already up, standing at the sink, staring into nothing. He didn't turn when she entered, didn't look at the capsule when she placed it on the counter beside him. He simply said, "That should have been gone with the rest." No inflection, no alarm, just a statement of fact, like noting the rain had arrived early. She asked what it was, what it meant, but he only sighed, picked it up carefully, and dropped it into a paper bag, folding the top 3 times before placing it under the sink. "They'll know you touched it," he said, and then, after a beat, added, "You need to stop coming out here alone." The next morning, she found 2 more, one embedded in a tree root at the edge of the yard, another wedged between stones along the old sprinkler system, each identical, each marked with a different number. 3rd of August. She didn't tell her father, not because she wanted to hide them, but because something in his face had changed since the first one. Not fear, not anger, but a kind of slow, resigned decay, as if the very presence of those objects had begun corroding the foundations of his sense of control. Later that day, a crew of landscapers arrived without warning. Unmarked truck, matching uniforms. Polite but impenetrable. They said the HOA had authorized new perimeter integrations, which required them to dig around the property and install updated wiring. They didn't ask for permission. They simply said they'd be done by sunset. Laura watched from the window as they worked in near silence, each man assigned to a quadrant, each one moving with an eerie synchronization that unsettled her more than their presence. They dug narrow trenches, precisely curved, always stopping at exact points that didn't align with utility grids or irrigation paths. When she approached one of them, asked what exactly they were installing, the man smiled as if she were a child asking why the sky was blue. "Just optimizing signal clarity," he said. "Interference has been a problem lately. It's nothing you need to worry about." She told them to stop. The man nodded, but didn't relay the message. No one stopped. Her father didn't come outside. He stayed seated at the table, fingers laced, watching the same corner of the yard for hours. When she finally asked him why he wouldn't intervene, why he was letting them tear up the land, he replied, "Because we agreed to this. Years ago, I just never thought they'd enforce it." She tried to get him to explain, but he shut down. She saw it, the way his shoulders sank, the way his mouth folded in on itself. A man folding inward. That night, long after the crew had left and the trenches had been covered again with soil that looked too smooth, too uniform, Laura ventured outside. She didn't bring a flashlight. She didn't need one. The dirt lines shimmered faintly in the dark like veins under skin. When she stepped across one of them, her phone vibrated in her pocket, though she hadn't received any message. She pulled it out. Screen black. Dead. Even though it had been fully charged an hour ago. She walked the perimeter twice. The house seemed smaller from out here, more exposed. The silence felt staged, artificial, like something was muting the air around her. The next morning, she found a formal envelope tucked under the front doormat. No postage, no name, just the HOA seal. Inside, a single page. "Your recent movements have activated a misalignment in your zone. For your safety and the integrity of surrounding properties, remain within your approved boundary until recalibration is complete. No further instructions. No contact number." When she showed it to her father, he folded it in half and placed it in the fireplace without reading it. "This is what happens when people forget what words used to mean," he said, and that was all. Later that day, while replacing a bulb on the back porch, Laura noticed a metallic glint in the crawlspace just beneath the deck. Another capsule. This one marked 00. When she reached for it, she realized it wasn't resting there. It was embedded in the wood, as if it had grown into the grain. She backed away slowly. Her hands were shaking. For the first time, she felt not like a daughter watching her father's secrets collapse, but like an intruder in her own reality, tiptoeing through something that had never been hers to witness. And as the sun dipped below the fence line and the air took on that familiar, oppressive stillness, Laura understood that something had shifted in the space around her. Some unspoken boundary had been crossed, not broken, just acknowledged, and there would be no crossing back. Laura began waking up at 4:13 a.m. every morning. Not because of noise or light, but because her body now seemed trained to respond to something deeper, something imperceptible yet undeniable. At first, she thought it was the shift in temperature or the familiar groan of old floorboards adjusting in the night. But when she lay still and allowed her senses to reach beyond the walls of the house, she noticed the rhythm. Soft, almost geological, a pulsing she could feel in her sternum like the echo of distant machinery. Every morning it came, precise and undisturbed, ending just before the sun crept above the horizon. Marvin didn't comment on her early rising. In fact, he no longer commented on much of anything. His silence had grown denser, more intentional, and she began to suspect that even his smallest movements were part of some larger choreography he refused to explain. He no longer asked questions, nor did he offer answers. He simply existed in the house like a man who'd already seen the conclusion and had nothing left to negotiate with the present. On the 5th day of her strange new routine, Laura noticed a pattern. The capsules she'd found, now 7 in total, were not placed randomly. Their numbers weren't sequential, and their locations formed no clear geometric design. But when she marked them on a printed satellite image of the backyard, she noticed that the only space left untouched by their presence was the old storm cellar, beneath the garden shed's foundation. It had been welded shut for as long as she could remember, its handles rusted and sealed by thick industrial bolts. Her father had always said it flooded too easily, and she had believed him because it was the kind of banal, believable excuse that no one questions. But now, with the shed gone and the backyard dissected by invisible lines and dead soil, that trapdoor stood out like a mouth forcibly held shut. That evening, after Marvin had gone to bed, Laura retrieved the heavy-duty crowbar from the garage and returned to the garden. The air felt charged, brittle. She could hear her own breath too clearly. The bolts resisted, but she didn't stop, not even when the steel cried out with a sound so unnatural it made her jaw ache. The door gave way slowly, with a shudder and a sigh, revealing a narrow staircase leading into a darkness so complete it seemed to absorb light. She descended, phone in hand, flashlight trembling. The cellar wasn't large, just a rectangular room lined with shelves and low cabinets, but every surface was pristine. Not dusty, not untouched, pristine, as though someone had been cleaning it regularly, preparing it. On the far wall hung a large corkboard filled with pinned notes, maps, and what looked like aerial photos, their edges curling from age but meticulously preserved. Strings of red thread linked various points, some labeled with dates, others marked only with sets of 4-digit numbers. In the corner sat an old generator, its casing sleek and unbranded, humming so quietly it barely registered. A clipboard lay on a workbench, and when Laura picked it up, she realized it was a logbook. Not of power usage, but of activity. Notes like Sequence 6 initiated, full sync, and external response, minimal interference, peppered the margins. The last entry was dated 2 weeks before the shed burned. It read, Containment integrity breached. Passive phase no longer viable. She staggered back, heart hammering, suddenly aware that this wasn't some forgotten hobby or private workshop. This was surveillance. This was testing. She didn't know what this was. She took photos, but her phone shut off again, just like it had by the trenches. When she powered it back on, the images were gone. No corrupted files, no storage warning. Just erased. Upstairs, she found her father in the kitchen, waiting. He didn't ask where she'd been. He only said, "You should have left it shut." She demanded he tell her what he had been doing, what the capsules were, who was watching them. Marvin's eyes were bloodshot but dry. It wasn't supposed to go past observation. That was the agreement. They said it would stay theoretical. His voice cracked on the last word, and she saw it. Not just the regret, but the weight of complicity. He had been part of this, whatever this was, and he had believed, with some naive corner of his soldier's mind, that keeping it contained made him a safeguard rather than a participant. "What were you observing?" she asked, and he said only, "Patterns, reactions, thresholds." But the signals changed. The environment started responding. When she pressed further, asked who they were, he finally looked at her, not like a father to a daughter, but like someone seeing another human clearly for the first time. "You still think this is about people." It's not. The next day, the backyard was different. Nothing visible had changed, but the atmosphere was wrong. The wind moved strangely, refusing to follow its usual path through the trees. The birds were gone. Even the neighbor's dog, which barked like clockwork every morning, was silent. Laura walked the perimeter again, this time marking the exact time each time her phone lost signal. It happened every 62 seconds, lasting exactly 9 seconds. Always the same span, as if her movement through the space triggered a scheduled sequence. When she told Marvin, he closed his eyes and whispered something under his breath that sounded rehearsed, memorized long ago. "What is it?" she asked. He didn't respond. That night, while washing the dishes, she looked up and saw 3 small lights blinking across the backyard in a straight horizontal line. Soft, amber glows, perfectly equidistant, positioned just above the ground. They blinked twice, paused, blinked once, then shut off. 30 seconds later, a soft knock sounded at the front door. She opened it to find no one, only a small black envelope on the welcome mat. Inside, a folded piece of paper, blank except for a set of coordinates and the phrase, "We were watching the wrong thing." The next morning, Marvin was gone. His wallet, keys, and coat were still there. His shoes, still by the door. No signs of struggle, no notes, just absence, surgical and total. Laura called the sheriff, who took a report with the disinterest of a man who had done this too many times and found it always ended the same, with nothing, no leads, no calls, just a file number and a reminder to give it a few days. But Laura knew. He wasn't missing. He had been retrieved. She returned to the cellar that night, determined to understand what he had left behind. But the room was empty, shelves wiped clean. Corkboard gone. The floor glistened with moisture, though it hadn't rained. In the center of the room stood a single object. Another capsule, larger than the others, marked in red ink. O1X. When she reached for it, the room's light dimmed as if inhaling. She stepped back. The capsule clicked open. Nothing exploded. Nothing hissed. Just a slow unfolding, like a flower or a lens adjusting to light. Inside was a slip of paper, yellowed and soft, on which a single sentence was printed in her father's typewriter font. "They don't burn structures. They burn witnesses." Laura didn't leave the house for the next 48 hours. Something inside her had shifted. No longer the passive disorientation of someone trying to interpret odd events, but a colder, slower awareness that she was no longer in a recognizable framework of reality. The capsule from the cellar, the one labeled O1X, now sat sealed inside a lead-lined kitchen drawer she had improvised using thick foil and 2 baking trays. Every instinct told her that opening it again, even for a moment, would bring something irrevocable to the surface. She didn't know what would happen, but she believed her father's message, and more importantly, she believed that someone else, whoever had collected him, did too. On the 3rd morning, the doorbell rang. She didn't answer it. It rang again, then once more, but this time it was followed by a low chime. A melody, artificial and precise, not from the doorbell system she knew. When she peeked through the peephole, she saw a familiar shape standing on the porch. Graham, the HOA representative with the velvet voice and neutral expressions. He held no clipboard this time, no forms or pamphlets. He was empty-handed, wearing a light gray coat, and his expression, though still polished, carried a shadow of discomfort, as though he himself was uncertain why he had come. She opened the door halfway, blocking the entrance with her shoulder. Graham gave a small nod. "Miss Winslow," he began, his tone as composed as ever, "there's been a recalibration affecting your lot. Some anomalies registered during the last scan." She didn't respond. He continued, as if following a script he couldn't alter. "We'd like to conduct a proximity analysis. It won't take long. You wouldn't even need to leave the house." His eyes flicked past her shoulder, toward the hallway. "Our technician can begin immediately." Laura felt her jaw clench. "I don't consent to any scans," she said firmly. "This property is privately owned, and you have no jurisdiction inside it." Graham smiled softly as if she'd said something quaint. "Of course, but please understand, consent is a legacy mechanism. We've transitioned to integrated permission structures. Your father approved baseline alignment years ago, and the framework persists." Laura stared at him, trying to decipher whether he understood what he was saying or was simply a vessel reciting memorized data. Before she could speak, another figure appeared at the foot of the walkway. A woman in an identical gray coat, shorter, with a tablet in her hands. She stood still, not approaching, just watching, her finger resting gently on the screen. "If you refuse formal scanning," Graham continued, his voice still calm but now coated in something harder, "we'll need to isolate the boundary zone manually. It could interfere with your local systems. Water, electricity, navigation." Laura stepped back and shut the door without another word. By nightfall, the power was gone. Not out, not flickering, just absent. Lights didn't respond. Outlets produced nothing. Even the batteries in her smoke detector and wall clock were dead, the LCD screens displaying soft flickers of distorted characters instead of time. Her phone refused to power on. The air inside the house felt humid and still, and when she lit a candle in the living room, the flame pulled consistently toward the eastern wall, as if pulled by a draft that didn't exist. She checked the windows, closed, checked the vents, sealed. Still, the air moved. That night, she walked the perimeter with a flashlight and a notepad, marking every place where the beam bent or dimmed unnaturally. Her movements felt uncoordinated, like trying to walk against a current underwater. When she returned inside, her skin itched faintly, her fingertips tingling with static. She bathed in cold water and lay awake, not quite afraid, but held in place by a mounting sense that the house was no longer a shelter. It had become a witness, a receptacle for whatever system had been placed around her. The next morning, she found her father's toolbox emptied onto the dining room table. Not by her. She hadn't touched it in days. The tools were arranged in deliberate rows, symmetrical, the screwdriver handles all facing the same direction, the wrench sizes lined in descending order. A single capsule lay at the center, differently shaped from the others, this one elongated, with a small transparent lens embedded in its side. Beneath it, a folded page torn from a book. No title. No page number. Only a sentence printed in bold. Containment is no longer an option. Observation must escalate. She didn't remember picking up the capsule, but that night she dreamt of it, floating at eye level in the dark, slowly rotating, its lens pulsing like an artificial pupil. In the dream, she saw herself reflected in the lens, but the reflection wasn't hers. It was a version of her standing very still, staring back with no expression. The next day, she received her first official violation. A yellow notice stuck to her front window read, "Environmental instability detected. Compliance re-evaluation required. Refrain from external contact or navigation until further instruction." She tore it down. No one responded. She screamed into the empty yard. The wind did not answer. But that night the lights came back on, only the ones in the backyard. They blinked in intervals, coordinated again, but now in new formations. Rows of 2, then columns of 3, then a grid pattern, a code. She no longer wondered who was watching. She wondered if they were even watching anymore, or if now they were measuring her, testing her responses, cataloging her behaviors like a laboratory rat trying to learn its cage. When she returned inside, the lead-lined drawer had been pried open. The capsule marked O1X was gone. In its place sat a folded sheet of paper, this one typed, perfectly formatted, signed HOA Committee, Calibration Division. It read, "Thank you for your cooperation." Phase 2 begins now. The night Phase 2 began. Laura stopped trying to resist the sense that she was inside something scripted, and instead began to look for the edges of the script, the seams where it frayed. The backyard lights had returned in full grid, blinking at precise intervals that suggested not communication, but calibration, as though the house itself was now a point on some greater map she had never been meant to see. She had not left in days. She knew instinctively that leaving would not return her to safety, but only push her deeper into whatever landscape had been designed around her. Instead, she walked through the house, touching the walls, pressing her ear to the plaster, listening for the hum she had grown accustomed to in her chest, and when she stopped fighting it, she realized the sound was no longer external at all. It lived inside her, synced with her pulse, adjusting every time she moved between the rooms. She tried to tell herself she was imagining it, but when she turned sharply in the mirror above the sink, she caught her reflection lagging by half a second, eyes locking onto hers with a delay that made her stumble backward. She smashed the mirror with her fist, but the glass fell in perfect triangular shards, as if cut deliberately, and she understood then that there was no destruction that would not be recorded. Just before midnight, she heard footsteps in the yard. She turned off every candle, every light, crouched by the back door, and waited. 3 figures stood on the charred foundation where the shed had once been. They were not in gray coats this time, but in plain dark clothes, their faces unremarkable, their movements synchronized. Each placed a capsule on the ground, forming a triangle, and then stepped back. The capsules vibrated softly, light spilling upward in thin beams that met in midair to form a lattice. It wasn't fire. It wasn't electricity. It was containment, something invisible woven into visible form. Laura felt it pressing on her skin even from behind the glass door. She wanted to scream at them, to break the lattice, but her body would not move, as though some agreement she had never signed had already dictated her compliance. Then she heard a voice, amplified but close, and it was not one of the strangers. It was her father's. "Step outside, Laura." She froze. The voice was calm, measured, not distorted by distance. "They've allowed me to speak. You don't have to fight it anymore. Just step outside and it ends." Her heart raced. Every instinct told her it was wrong, but every memory of her father told her that ignoring his voice was impossible. Slowly, she opened the back door. The air shifted, heavy with static, and the lattice beams bent toward her as if recognizing her presence. The three strangers didn't move, but she felt their attention like heat. Her father's voice came again, but now it sounded tired, unraveling. "They don't need me anymore. They needed you. I tried to keep you outside of it, but the moment you touched the first capsule, it was decided. Just stand in the center. That's all." The lattice pulsed, brightened, and she realized the center of the triangle aligned perfectly with the trap door of the old storm cellar. She shook her head, whispered no under her breath, but the sound seemed to disappear before reaching the air. She looked for her father, but he was nowhere, only the voice circling in her skull. The lattice expanded, stretching toward the house, and in that instant she felt the walls vibrating, the hum in her chest now overwhelming, as if her heartbeat belonged to a larger machine. Something in her snapped. She ran forward, not into the center, but toward one of the capsules on the ground. She kicked it hard, sending it skittering across the dirt. The lattice fractured, the beams shuddering, and the three strangers turned toward her for the first time. Their faces were blank, their eyes dark, but she knew they hadn't expected her to disrupt the sequence. She grabbed the capsule before they could react, held it to her chest, and screamed, "You don't burn structures. You burn witnesses." The words tore out of her like fire. For a second, the entire grid collapsed. The lights in the yard, the hum in her chest, even the air seemed to empty. A vacuum of silence. The strangers dissolved into the darkness like smoke. The lattice flickered once more and vanished. Laura collapsed to her knees, clutching the capsule. The night returned to ordinary silence. No humming, no flickering, no lights. But she knew it was not over, because when she looked down at the capsule in her hands, the number etched into its surface was not a sequence at all, but her own initials. In the days that followed, the house returned to something resembling normal, but Laura knew better than to believe in appearances. The backyard stood unnervingly still, the soil on the old shed's foundation perfectly flat, no trace of ash or disruption, as though the fire, the lattice, and the strangers had been swallowed by some unseen correction in the system. The capsule with her initials remained locked inside the drawer she had once used for her father's notes, and every time she walked past it she felt the same dull vibration in her bones, a reminder that what had happened was not finished. Only paused. The neighbors waved when she passed them, their smiles slightly too measured, their voices carrying phrases that sounded like rehearsed greetings. No one mentioned the fire, the cruise, or the sudden blackout. When she called the sheriff's office again to ask about her father's disappearance, she was told there was no record of her earlier report. No file number, no log, as though she had never called. At night, she sat on the porch, listening for the hum that had once filled her chest, but the silence was almost worse. She thought about leaving, packing what she could and driving north until the landscape felt unfamiliar enough to belong to her again. But something held her back. Not fear exactly, but a reluctant understanding that departure would not erase her from the map. The system didn't need fences or boundaries to follow her. She had been integrated the moment the shed burned, maybe even earlier, and carrying the capsule away would only widen the circle. One evening, as the sun sank low and the shadows lengthened across the flat ground, she caught her reflection in the glass of the sliding door. For a second, she thought it lagged again, that same unnatural delay she had seen before, but this time it didn't frighten her. It felt more like recognition, as if some part of her had caught up with the truth. Her father had tried to shield her, but in the end he had only postponed what had already been written. They didn't burn structures. They burned witnesses. And now she was one of them. When she turned away from the glass, she noticed something new. Faint circles of grass sprouting at the edges of the foundation, perfectly symmetrical, impossibly green against the dry soil. She didn't touch them. She didn't need to. She already knew what they meant.